Professor Michael Fulford has been Professor of Archaeology at the University of Reading since 1988, and obviously has done many other things. What we're interested in is Mike has been the director of the Silchester Insula 9 Town Life Project from 1997, which myself and I think a number of other people from the field club have actually attended as diggers. He has also directed from 2018 the Silchester Roman Baths project, which was visited by our section in the halcyon days of 2019, when you could still do these things. And we found it was totally fascinating. It's a very complex thing, so I think I should hand over to Mike to explain all about the Silchester Town Baths. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and it's great to be here again and talking about some archaeology. And I hope this talk is going to give you a nice feel of where we hope we will be going this summer, with the relaxation of all the constraints on us. And so I'm going to get straight on with the talk now. I'm not sure which click did it, but anyway. So I'm sure all of you are absolutely familiar with this plan of Silchester. It's simplified. It is the plan that the Society of Antiquaries made at the end of their, towards the end of their great 20-year project at Silchester, 1908. So you can see that familiar plan, the street grid, the buildings, and then highlighted here in the southeast corner of the town, you've got the bathhouse. And I'll come back to this, of course, again, note that the orientation of the bathhouse is slightly askew to the line of the east-west street, which it gives access to. So that's the position of the bathhouse. And we began excavating here, not in 1903, 1904, which is what you're seeing on your screen now. This is the original excavation by the Society of Antiquaries, and this was one of the first complete excavations of a Roman town bathhouse ever done in Roman Britain. So it was a great project, and pretty much all the interior of the baths was excavated. So you might just wonder why it was worth coming back again to a site which has had that comment over the years that this is a site that's been apparently exhausted, but I'm sure you're aware that actually we're only just beginning to get to know something about the Roman town of Silchester and its Iron Age predecessor. But it's good to have something to work with. And again, if you go back to the Insula 9 project, one of the remarkable things which emerged from that project was indications of some quite high status building that must have dated to the 1st century AD. And all that we had to go on then was some stamped tiles stamped with the name and the titles of the Roman Emperor Nero. But we didn't have much to contextualize what Nero or his agents were doing in Silchester in his reign, which was in the middle of the 1st century AD, AD 54 to 68. And when we finished digging Insula 9, I wanted to learn a bit more about this early phase of the town, and it seemed appropriate to look at the baths where the first Nero stamped tile was found way back in 1903-4 by the antiquaries, but found sort of pretty much out of context in a pit outside the baths, but everybody thinks it probably came from the baths. And to see the kiln site where these tiles are thought to have originated, the kiln site at Little London at Pamba, just a sort of mile and a half south of the Roman town. So in 2017, we did an excavation on the Tylery at Little London, and that was amazingly successful, and it did confirm that brickmaking went on there, and it went on there during the reign of Nero, and we've got some idea about what buildings were being supplied with bricks from that source at Little London. And that work, I'm happy to say, is very nearly ready for the publisher, and with a bit of luck might be your Christmas present for 2021. So the baths were a natural successor to the Tylery project, and we began looking at that in 2018, and our starting point was really the plan that you see in front of you. This is the plan drawn up published in 1905, and what's remarkable about it is that here, really for the first time in the antiquaries' work at Silchester, they've attempted to work out a phasing for the development of the baths. So on this slide, you can see the different colours, and black here represents sort of the earliest phase of building, and later phases are represented in green and also in blue. So they defined 6 periods for the baths, and perhaps importantly, they recognized that up near the street, and I hope you can see this, that they realized, and this goes back to what I was saying just now, that the baths changed the orientation was changed in the sense that when the street grid was laid out, it obliterated part of the frontage of the baths, and a new, if you like, front wall was constructed. So this goes back to this point about the baths being askew to the street grid, therefore earlier, and that was all, if you like, taken on board by the antiquarian archaeologists. So certainly the baths, with that associated find of the Nero brick stamp and this relationship with the street grid, looked to be early. So, you know, a good site really to explore and try and get some handle on what might relate to the early phase of the baths. So it is a big complex, and those of you that visited in 2019 will appreciate the scale. And while one would have loved to have opened the entirety of the building, resources are not such as to let that happen. Where are we? What am I trying to get it to move on again? Oh, here we are. Wait a minute. Ooh, need to go back. There we are. So we had a number of fairly basic questions. Wanted to confirm the dating. Only recently, really, have we had a clear idea of the date of the street grid. And the street grid looks as if it's around about the mid-80s, 85, something like that. We wanted to learn a bit more about how the baths might have changed over time, because although you've got that sequence on that plan of 1905, we have no dates attached to any of those elements as the baths changed over time. The antiquarian excavation focused on the building. It didn't look very much outside the building, and that area seemed to offer potential to get some idea of use of the baths from any waste material, rubbish that had accumulated around the baths during its potential 400 years of use. What could we learn from environmental evidence? What could we learn from artifactual evidence? And then, of course, questions about how the baths worked and how they sat in the town, how the water supply was organized, how drainage of the baths, and so on. So a lot of new questions one could pose to complement what was achieved at the beginning of the 20th century. So this slide shows the areas that we've investigated so far. At the top of the baths, you've got the entrance, the colonnade, then you open up into a courtyard area. And so we excavated that facade. We opened up an area on the eastern side, and this area goes outside the baths here. And then it includes this slice through the ditch of what we believe to be the earthwork of the very late Iron Age. So we were actually also capturing the possibility of understanding something about late Iron Age Calaver, but a ditch sequence which might give us some of that environmental evidence to help us understand about use and health and so on. And then on the western side in 2019, we opened this area to explore what the antiquarians described as warm rooms, as tepidaria, and we linked the two areas across like that. And each trench, each excavation has added incredible new knowledge to what we know. First of all, and this is completely new to the plan, very low down on that eastern side where we were excavating to get the inner earthwork ditch, unexpectedly we came across this foundation, well mortared, low. So far we don't have a date for it, but conceivably it's part of a very early phase of the baths. It sits right above this ditch, and it has a wooden gully, a wooden water channel that runs around it. That became evident in 2019, but it wasn't on the antiquarian plan, and it lies at some significant depth. And trying to understand what this is all about is a major objective for our next season. So even after two really quite short seasons, we're getting substantial new insight into the baths, even if we don't fully understand it. So just to show you where that structure is, what we've exposed is a right angle here, and we've projected an overall plan like that. So it's there. There's the line of the Iron Age ditch running through. So it's right above the ditch, and one wonders whether it was possibly a latrine that drained into that ditch, and I'll explain why later. And also, it could have been housing some sort of water lifting device. So the ditch here could have been a source of water to feed the baths in its early phase. Now, what you've got on this screen, in addition to this, as it were, this enigmatic feature, is the outline plan of what we think might have been a first bath suite. And this, I suppose, is perhaps the major advance in our knowledge of these baths, is that actually what the antiquarians miss completely is that, setting aside this mysterious structure for the moment, that they basically missed that there were two successive bathhouses. A bathhouse that I think is arguably Nero, and then a bathhouse which dates to the very beginning of the 2nd century, so maybe 40 or 50 years later. And that's what we've got outlined in red. And I'll pick up some of the evidence here. You can see how this trench, we've got something showing of that phase. We've got something I'll show you in a minute up here, and then down in this trench, picking up various elements. And we can link that back to other elements in that original 1905 plan. So if we take the entrance, here we have the re-excavation and the original excavation. So 2018 on the right, 1903 or 1904 on the left. And the main difference between the 2 years is that the column that sat in the middle here has gone. I mean, I hope it's in Reading Museum, but haven't yet been able to find out if it's there, and the others still extant. And they sit on this this brick plinth, and that all those bricks are Little London bricks, as are the bricks in the main facade, which I'll show you in a second. So this slide, you're looking to the east. That relates to the building after the laying out of the street, and all of this was buried by the street grid of the late 1st century, after about AD 85. And so all these columns were chopped off in the late 1st century. And then looking behind, you've got a complex building. This is the latrine block. Right at the back, you can see, I hope, the arch of the drain. And most of what you see there is much later than this original, what I'm calling Neronian phase. And this, you see the heightening for the rebuild of the facade of the baths, so that it actually ran alongside the line of the new east-west street. And this is a new column to support the entrance into the baths. So things were becoming clearer, but also we found that there are things on that antiquarian plan which didn't seem to reflect in what we found on the ground. But that's a minor consideration when we go forward and think about the full extent of the Nero baths. And this is, I think it's the only complete Nero brick stamp, and this is the one that was found beside the baths. Need to go back. And you can see very clearly N, thumbprint where the ears, thumbprint R for Nero, CL short for Claudius, CAE for Caesar, AUG for Augustus, G, and then ER short for Germanicus. So Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Germanicus. And this is on display in Reading Museum. So bricks of the same fabric have been found in this first phase in that colonnade that fronted the baths. But perhaps one of the most important things which we observed in our first season, and then, as it were, the penny dropped in 2019, was the realization that there had been a substantial addition to the frontage of the baths, which you can see in this construction here. So you've got, where my pointer is, you've got a butt joint. To the right, and using Little London bricks, is the Nero facade. And this has been added on, a new extension, bricks resting here on piles of alder wood. And here you've got the water leat running right way through to the latrines on the eastern side. So this important junction was not appreciated in 1903, for it doesn't appear on the plan, but it represents an enlargement and also a raising of levels of the baths of a new construction around about the beginning of the 2nd century AD. So we'll move on from this important observation that of an extension added on. This is the northwest corner of the baths, and more of this became apparent in 2019. So here I'm taking you to a shot that's looking at the corner of that exercise yard, the palaestra as it's called. So from that entrance into the baths, you go into this colonnaded area where you could potentially exercise, work up an appetite for taking the baths, if you like. And so here we took out the backfill from the early excavations, and we've exposed what was the back wall. So this wall marks the division between that open courtyard and the baths proper, which go down to the south. And in this area, you've got a drain which has been covered with roofing tiles and running across, and then out through what we now know to a rebuilt eastern wall of the baths. But look down here, and this was simply shown as, if you like, as a dotted line on the plan of 1903-4. So the antiquaries had found this, and these are their trench outlines. There's the edge of the trench. They'd found this foundation at a depth, and of course we can now see that this relates to this Neronian phase of the baths. Up here you have the corner of the ambulatory. So in the baths, this is the space you'd walk, the covered walkway around. Okay, so that's the inner wall of that, and then here would have been actually open to the elements. So this is part of the later rebuild. So early wall here, later wall partly built on existing masonry but largely new, and with it a new drain. So 2019 pennies began to drop, and this too is another Edwardian antiquarian little excavation. This actually was absolutely backfilled with chalk tesserae, solid with chalk tesserae. If you ever want a chalk tesserae, you know who to ask. What about this first set of baths? Was it finished? There's a question here, and we've only really got little bits of evidence. One of those bits of evidence is here, where we have the imprint of, in herringbone fashion, of the brick floor of what was described probably as the changing room of the baths. So you can see the herringbone pattern of the bricks, and these bricks are all in the Nero, with just one or two still surviving, all the Nero brick type, the Little London brick type. So there was a floor, and elsewhere there are traces of, right at the junction of wall and floor, little traces of wall plaster. So I think the Nero baths were finished. They certainly functioned, so here you see that plan again. Oh, Keats wants to move. And so the wall you've just been looking at is we've been looking at this area here, and this early wall coming through. So that's the point where you have the junction expanded, but this is essentially what we have. And of course, in this summer, I mean, if everything goes according to plan, we're going to open an area down to the south to sort of chase through this early plan, and then to try and work out what on earth this bit is doing. Is it very early, or is it actually tagged on to the later phase? So the next slide, I think, perhaps is more helpful in showing the early, and then the early baths, and then their successor, what I'll call for now the Trajanic baths. I think they were built in the reign of Trajan, which is the blue on this. So this is the outline, and this is effectively what the antiquaries, they thought this was the baths, and they kind of ignored and just showed us dotted lines what is now on that slide as red. And so some of this we're absolutely clear about. Some of what we put is extrapolation, but I think pretty confident about what we have here. So an Neronian baths constructed 50s, 60s of the first century. Something went radically wrong, such that they were demolished, and they started again within 2 generations by the end of the first, beginning of the 2nd century. Flooding may have been an issue because we're at the lowest point of the town, right down where the springs rise. So flooding might have been an issue, and certainly levels were raised with the new build by over ½ meter. So quite a substantial dumping of material to bring all the levels up. And if we go now to the western side, we can see again, follow through some elements of the early. So again, here is one of these, this early wall running through. Again, dotted line on the 1903-4, the plan published in 1905. But then this is the Tridanic, the beginning of 2nd century build here. And this is for a warm room. And although many of the pili, the stacks of tiles which supported the floor to allow hot air to circulate underneath, many of those have been taken away completely. There are 1 or 2 in situ, but you get the feel of that structure. And I think one of the things, the other thing which came well through, I think both in 2018 and 2019, is how much the baths required fiddling around with. Things don't seem to have worked for very long without requiring change, sometimes of quite a substantial scale. So here you've got this foundation of reused masonry, mortared together, stuck on top of pili. You can see a little bit of a square there. So it's just put there against the back wall. The furnace feeding the this room was down here. Here's the furnace, you ask yourself, you know, what was going on? What was the problem? And I can only think that they built this in to reduce the amount of space they had to heat, so that they were having issues in heating these large spaces. So the furnace is here, and the furnace also is running through, this is all part of the Tridanic structure, fairly massive foundations, which I think probably supported an actual bath which held hot water. And then there's change and things are rebuilt, and there is a major, I'm jumping ahead. Well, let's move on to the next slide and you'll see what I mean. So this is this foundation of reused masonry. You can see all bits of tile stuck together, stuck over. You can see, look, there's a pili stack, there's another pili stack. So they've just reduced the space to be heated. And in the end, that doesn't seem to work. And they decide to move to a position where they abandon that hot room and start again. So just to take you through the story. So here in the yellow, here is the original. This is Nero, quite a small bath suite. So there's just about a 20% addition to the space of the Nero baths with a new set of baths. Then we move on to Trajan here in the green, and this end here, which I think supported actual hot bath. So that's Nero. Then you see the beginnings of change. You got a new structure butted on at the western end, and inside that you've got hypercourse tiles which are pretty well preserved, and a complete reorientation so that the furnace now fires from right to left, from east to west. So it's firing into this space. So in the end, here in red, you're left with this smaller, it may still have supported a hot bath, a smaller tepidarium here, and the space to the right, the pre-existing tepidarium, has been completely abandoned, and this has become a working area. And you ask yourself whether or not it was still roofed, but certainly in order for this furnace to work, the hypercourse has been removed, the floor's taken out, and you begin to wonder whether, and this change seems to take place probably in the late 3rd or early 4th century, if by then the bath house is losing its integrity as a single structure and beginning to break down into different elements. So one part is the hot bath, another is a warm room, and so on. And to what extent it could accommodate both men and women is again debatable. Originally, I think that was the plan, but whether that could be sustained and they moved to some other way of allowing men and women to bathe, again, we're not so sure. The early excavators didn't dwell much on what the baths were built of, and through our excavation, we've recovered quite a lot of material to illustrate some of the ornamentation. So, for example, here is a find of these very hard chalk tesserae, chalk probably from the Isle of Purbeck. And next to this is just an array of different wall plasters, probably different phases. We haven't really had a chance to look at them. And that this piece certainly is relating to something different, either a different phase or a completely different space within the baths, whereas there's some degree of homogeneity about the color schemes, the yellows and the greens of this slide. So again, I think at the end of this, we're going to be able to offer some suggestion how each of those two major baths were decorated, and that will be interesting, because that's again going to be something new to the story. And of course, we've had tons and tons of loose brick and tile, ceramic building material, and I could illustrate hundreds of slides of this, but just to remind you, these are fragments of box flue tiles which took the hot air up the walls of the warm and hot rooms of the baths, and this distinctive comb decoration, which seems to belong pretty much to the Tridanic baths rather than the Nero baths. This combing is typical, and of course it allowed plaster to be laid on it and the plaster to adhere to it. So we've got, you know, an interesting story, and actually I think that's going to be another major element, is seeing how the supply of bricks and the sources of the brick changes over time. Because one of the things that we found out from Insula 9, even in the 1st century, they were bringing in brick to help with building projects. And this is brick which of course had been recycled into hard standings and the like, but not necessarily into buildings in Insula 9, but brick coming from as far away as the brick kilns at Minety in Wiltshire, not far from Silchester. So, you know, 100 kilometers away. So there's a lot to be learnt from the brick industry. And of course, that was a great interest of David Johnston, and he did some important work on the brick industry of Roman Britain. So then change over time. So we've seen how that Tridanic warm room eventually is abandoned, new suite built towards the end of the 3rd century, maybe beginning of 4th. And there are further significant changes which seem to relate to a bath which has in its structure lost its integrity. So right at the end of the Roman period, we find, and this is a slide taken in 2018, we find this structure, this composite hypercourse that's built, and it's built right on top of the enigmatic remains which I sort of started the talk with. It's right on top of it, so it replaced it. And this is constructed very well, if not in the 5th century, right at the very end, you know, circa 400. It sits right at the eastern end of the baths. And this is at a stage, we're looking northwards here, we're looking across the still hardly excavated ditch here. You can see some of the trial trenches of the antiquarian excavation here. Ooh, come back. Here's another one, partly excavated. These diagonal trenches, which were the exploration which led to the discovery and the opening of the whole bath structure. So we opened this tepidarium in its entirety, reopened it. On the antiquarian photos, it doesn't show very clearly what it is and how well it's preserved. And you can see the preservation is very, very good. So in the center, you've got this the floor supported by stacks of reused tile, but around the periphery, the floor is supported perhaps much more robustly by these masses of masonry, which are bisected from one another by these deep channels. So the hot air circulating along those rather than through masses of these pili, which would have been the format of the baths in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And this looks clunky and clumsy, but I think it was a way of stopping the floor collapsing, because when you start covering areas like this with tiles, the chances of fractures, the chances of, you know, what happens in a, you know, a hard English winter to these baths, when you've got freezing going on, maybe tile beginning to shatter. You can imagine quite a lot of broken legs actually from people who fell down in these heated suites. So making these masses of masonry helps to make the floor more durable. So this was a great discovery, but it seems to sit on its own on the eastern edge of the baths, and replacing that earlier structure which overlooked the ditch. And the ditch, of course, which is a piece of Herculean excavation. I don't know if you remember in 2019 seeing, I think when you came, we'd pretty much got to the bottom, but here the excavation in progress, and it went down over 4 meters deep. And you might well ask, where are their safety crash helmets? And I don't know where they are, but they're probably just not on this slide. Trick of photography. And anyway, fantastic stratigraphy, some good preservation of through waterlogging, of course, and some remarkable finds in this sequence, which also in their way reflect to the use of the baths. So right at the very, very bottom, so 4 meters or so down, we found a collection of dog skulls. So you can see dog skull here, there's a mandible, another mandible, so one complete. I think altogether we had 3 complete skulls and then a set of mandibles. So they're all close together. And then about 40 centimeters, nearly half a meter, a couple of feet above them, was this gentleman, or at least his skull. A young man, skull carefully laid on this stretcher made of hazel rods and willow. You can see the format of it quite clearly. And this deposition is actually around about the time of the construction of the Trajanic baths. So the set of dog skulls deposited as some sort of ritual. It's hard to think that they went in, as it were, by accident. And there's no trace of the rest of their skeletons. So you have the deposition of dogs right early on, say contemporary with the Nero construction, and then higher up in this ditch sequence, we have this skull dating to around about AD 100, but the skull conceivably actually a bit older, possibly Iron Age, which is the date we think the ditch was originally dug, right at the end of the Iron Age, as part of the defense of Karatakis' Kaleva. So an enigma, and we've got more work to do on it, but we do have this radiocarbon date, which puts him a little bit earlier, before the conquest, back in what looks to be the 1st century BC, but clearly discovered during the construction of the Trajanic baths and carefully laid on this stretcher in the ditch. So again, a formal deposition. I mean, we don't know whether he was a Roman or a Brit, but maybe we'll find that out in due course. So then through the sequence of the ditch, my colleague Petra Dark has been looking at pollen, and she's also been looking at parasite eggs contained in the sediments in the ditch. So we've taken these tins, taking a slice through. Perhaps you can see right here's a sort of profile of the ditch here, and then these coloured things show the various tins that have been taken to get a complete sequence. And what I think was really exciting, exciting from our point of view, perhaps not so exciting from the point of view who deposited them, but right at the bottom and right through the whole sequence, the silts are full of intestinal parasite eggs, mostly of this gentleman here, whipworm. But alongside that is a good sequence of pollen, which shows the changing landscape in the immediate environment of the baths. Open, then it becomes slightly more wooded, slightly overgrown, and then clears again later on. And of course, in that sequence, we have, of course, ceramic material, we have some animal bone, and we have plant macros, and all of those will help us understand what was going on. So the bone, for example, has produced quite a lot of fish bone, quite a lot of bird bone, and it's likely that these are beasties that were consumed in the baths, so snacking around the baths. So that's been enormously, and is being enormously interesting, and we're trying to keep a sort of a momentum of post-excavation and research going on as we continue with the baths. And then, a major issue is how do they manage the water supply to the baths? My colleague Rob Fry has been doing geophysics, and for the first time extensively using ground penetrating radar to try and pick up some likely courses of the water. And what he's, so on the top of this slide, you can see he's overlaid the plan on top of the geophysics, and we've got this area up here, which is of a high resistance, and we've got excavated features and so on, and evidence of the streets running through. But if I take you down to his interpretation, what I think we have found, and this is really interesting because it lies at the intersection of this north-south street and this east-west street, and that's the east-west street which runs across the facade of the baths. An anomaly which we think is a great system. And as it lies pretty much beneath the street at this junction, this must be early and the Neronian, a source of the Neronian water supply. And from it, there are these channels that he's detected. You can see those up here on the geophysics. Channels which take us in and then lead us to the channel that we re-excavated, found in 2018. So that's a really interesting and important element. So the baths are not supplied by a distant aqueduct. They're supplied by presumably a water lifting device, which is taking water out of a deep cistern. And I hope we'll get permission at least to try and put a core into this to get some idea of its scale this summer. So the geophysics has been immensely rewarding. And here, just to show that relationship in a little bit more detail, so you have the depths going down. So this is the ground penetrating radar, 50 centimeters, 100 centimeters. So that's at a meter depth, still showing very, very clearly underneath that intersection. 1 3/4 meters, still very much there. And at 3 1/4 meters depth, still something there. So potentially we have a cistern here which is over 3 to 4 meters in depth. So containing a sufficient volume of water fed by the springs all around it, but enough volume to keep a steady supply for when the baths were in use. So that's an important addition. And then, of course, we have the finds, and I'm only going to give you a few highlights of the finds. The most abundant find, other than brick and tile, which I won't go on about, the most abundant find, and other than pottery, are bone pins. And we assume the bone pins are to do with hair arrangements. And we assume, but this might be a rash thing to assume, that they are to do, and they evidence women in the baths, but women constantly breaking their hairpins or losing their hairpins, quite a lot of broken. But that's the most abundant. So we have nearly 100 of those bone pins. But we also have a fair amount of finger rings. And this is our star prize, this gold ring, which was found in 2018. And the next slide shows it in all its glory. So this is a 4th century, a clunky 4th century gold ring, lost in the baths, and unfortunately it's lost its stone. There would have been a gem in here, but you've got it in profile. So finger rings, but again, when you sort of reconstruct this, it's not a great big sort of man-sized finger. It could well be, again, a young person or a woman. And another star piece of find is this buckle and belt attachment, again beautifully preserved in the upper levels of the ditch, and it dates to the turn of the 4th and 5th century. So it's somebody who's had their uniform ripped off in the baths. They've lost their belt, and you can see the fine decoration. You see the little beastie here, which is the tongue of the buckle and the formation of the buckle and all this fine metalwork. So this belongs to that sort of category of late and indeed into 5th century metalwork that's associated with the Roman military and the Roman elite generally. And this is a piece which has no close parallel. So it's a very interesting piece and to start with, I thought it could well be actually properly medieval, but it's now clear that it's his end of 4th, beginning of 5th century. So there's some really superb finds and finds made by a wonderful team. And I think, I haven't actually counted the numbers, but this year, we're going to begin again in late May, but we're only going to be allowed to have, providing nothing comes in the way between now and then, a maximum of 30 people on site at any one time. So that's taken us through the excavation. And I just wanted to end with a plug, and perhaps others will plug this, but just to say that some easy reading for you over Christmas. It's literally just come out, and I literally today picked up my copy of this. This is an attempt to sort of bring together my work and the work of predecessors from really the 19th century onwards. So telling you a new story of Silchester. And of course, for the first time, it really says a lot more about the Iron Age than we ever knew before. So as you can see on this slide, it's on offer for a modest £13.60 until the end of April. But reading this, you'll be able to, all the questions you want to ask me are going to be answered by reading this book, of course. Anyway, I think I better stop there, and of course, happy to answer your questions.
We have got some questions coming through, and even as I speak. So these are people who obviously haven't seen the draft of your book, otherwise those questions would have been asked. I'm just having a quick look at what we've got so far. I mean, certainly the questioning seems to be around the structures that you found there, and I was interested when you were talking about structures on structures, that you're reusing so much of the early material. Is this something you see throughout Silchester? There's constant rebuilding and reuse of material?
Yes, I think this is the first example of a public building with a complete rebuilding within, well, I think less than half a century of its original construction. So this is a massive change. Whereas if you look at Insula 9, we have a gradual process of change where, you know, timber buildings give way to masonry and things change gradually, but on a domestic scale, if you like, rather than on a big public scale. I suppose what I think of as another possible parallel, I mean, you see obviously rebuilding in the amphitheatre, the Forum Basilica. I mean, that starts as a succession of timber buildings, but then the massive early 2nd century Forum Basilica, masonry Forum Basilica, is constructed. And that persists. That doesn't seem to change until it's demolished, probably in the post-Roman period. So this scale of rebuilding is unusual, and I think it's probably driven by the fact that Bath didn't always work terribly well. They had problems.
Right. Well, in fact, speaking of that, Maureen's asked, would the larger blocky foundations on the 5th century part of the hypocaust been as efficient for underfloor heating as Pile?
Well, they no, not as efficient. I think you'd have got quite hot in that central area, which supported, but a lesser warmth around. But at least I think you'd have been fairly certain you wouldn't fall through the floor, which I think was quite an important consideration.
It was a lovely imagery, I must admit. Michael's asked a similar question to what I was going to ask earlier, which was, is this the only set of baths at Silchester that you're aware of? Because it is a large baths, but then Silchester was a large city.
Yes, it's probably the only set of baths which was available to the general population, as far as we know, who actually was allowed to use it. The Mancio, that's the building which housed the accommodation for the state post, the cursus publicus, that had its own bath suite, but it's not clear that any of the private houses had a bath suite attached. That might need revisiting. There are some structures which don't look right, but in the quest for understanding a bit about this early phase and what Nero was doing in the town, we excavated in Insula 3, just to the west of the Forum, and the reason for that was that there the antiquaries claimed they'd found a bathhouse in the southeast corner of Insula 3, and because it was in a pretty poor state, judging by their account of it, I thought, oh, well, this is likely to be early. Let's have a look here and see if this will amplify our picture of 1st century Silchester. In the event, it wasn't a set of baths. It's the beginnings of the building of a private house, and of probably late 1st or early 2nd century date. So not at all what was thought of in the 1890s.
Right. And it's interesting you talk about centuries here. I've got a question here from Ben, who's age 7. How long would it have taken to build a Roman bathhouse? 4 centuries, I guess. Is
Well, I mean, the bathhouse was used certainly over 400 years in different ways. Its original construction, I suspect, took 2 or 3 years. It would depend how much labor they could put to the building. And that's an interesting question, how much skilled labor there was. Also obtaining some of the raw materials, because the stone that's used in that bathhouse in both periods, that is some green sand from the Weald, so it's come from 40 miles or more away. If you think of how much material was used for the hypocausts, for the flue tiles, the pili, and then the roofing, and keeping a flow of tile and roofing material coming through from the brick kilns, that must have been quite a business as well. And those kilns would only have really operated during the summer months. And the building program may well have stalled in the winter with the coming of the frosts. So 2 or 3 years maybe. But it's
okay, Ben, there you go. So it's longer than Lego, that's for sure. So if we move away from building, perhaps,
yes.
Someone asked about the skulls. Is there evidence, or do you think that they're ritual deposits in any way?
Well, I think the dogs must have been a deliberate ritual. I mean, what I puzzle about is that, by the time we got to the bottom of that ditch, the trench was only, little more than a metre to 2 meters wide. And you think, well, if we found that, what else is at the bottom of the ditch? And it's, the ditch is over, I don't know, a couple of kilometres long all the way around. It's sizable. But the skull that's laid on a stretcher, well, clearly there's purpose in that deposition. And my thinking is that that in that building of the Trajanic baths, they came across somebody who'd been buried earlier, and it's a reburial, but with a certain amount of formality around it, hence the creation of that willow and hazel stretcher that they used to lay the skull on. So yes, certainly ritual there.
Okay, and moving into a bit more scientific world, Anna Welsh, who, as we know, is a well-known scientist. Thank you, Anna. She's interested in the whipworms.
Yes.
They're found in association with pollen. Is there any evidence that the plant species were associated with natural remedies for instance, actually getting rid of intestinal parasites like whipworms?
As yet, the plant remains from that stitch sequence haven't yet been analysed.
No.
But one thing which Petra has observed, commented on, is that in some of the deposits which, and this goes back to Insula 9 as well as to perhaps the baths, is mallow turns up quite a lot. And mallow is not something you'd obviously use as for a fuel. So what is the mallow for? Is that being used medicinally in some way? And that's the one species that's really kind of stood out and has invited comment. Later on, we find hemlock seeds in latrine deposits. So people are taking hemlock perhaps to ease pain and that, but hopefully not overdoing it.
Okay, we're getting quite late now. Perhaps just one more question. I had it here a minute ago. Someone still on about her intestinal parasites, but she's mentioned haven't and Bournemouth University in the same sentence. So that's interesting. What was I going to mention? I think one of the things that did occur to me, I remember it when we were first there and having a look at how old the baths were. I mean, they were one of the earliest buildings of baths that we think in Britain.
Yes.
So is it likely that they lasted the whole length of time that Silchester was extant? And is there any evidence to show the very, very last dates that they were used?
That's again a bit of a work in progress. I think it's possible that elements of the baths continued to stand and may have been used for what they originally intended for well after the sort of end of Roman rule, from after the beginning of the 5th century. And one of the reasons I say that is that the outer walls around that very, very late tepidarium, that late hypocaust system, the walls had been robbed much more deeply than the main walls of the baths. And you wonder, why were those walls robbed so deeply down when elsewhere walls which simply cut down to the ground level at the time they were demolished? And one reason I think is perhaps those elements of the baths stood after large areas of the rest of the baths had already been demolished. And it was obvious to people who were looking for material to keep going down rather than stopping at ground level, going right the way down to the bottom of the foundation. So I wonder whether some of that very deep robbing was quite late on, perhaps late Saxon or early medieval.
Right.
And there's certainly quite a lot of medieval pottery from the uppermost horizons outside the baths. So
Right.
that's an intriguing question. I hope we'll get more insight into that.
Okay. Well, I mean, the great news for us is that you're going back again next year. I remember when we visited you in 2019, you said it was unlikely we were going back because of funding. But to think that you're going back this year is absolutely great. And you know who will be one of the, well, we'll be asking whether we can have a visit. Whether that will be possible is another matter, of course.
Yes.
We do look forward to something like that.
I hope, well, we'll see. It'll be easier after, I hope, after the 21st of June,
Yeah.
after that. And we'll certainly be on site for 2 further weeks after the 21st of June. So,
Fingers crossed.
well, you know, there's always be days when there aren't students. There's always be one day a week when there aren't any students. So maybe we can work around that.
Okay. Okie doke. I think that's probably it from us and our questions. So thanks for all your questions. Sorry if I didn't get round to yours. There were a lot of them. I'm just going to hand over to Jan now. If I could ask her to start her video, and oh, it should start up, and you should appear miraculously. And just to say a few words in closing.
Right. Yes. Am I there? No, I can't see.
You're on.
I'm on. Right.
You're on.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mike, for that incredibly interesting talk. And I hope you've borne with us with some of the techie stuff. But it's been great to do this, and I am very, very pleased that we've managed to do this finally. I think it sounds absolutely fascinating, but then it is so intriguing to have a structure which has been on the site all the time, as it were, and was being constantly modified. You wonder who on earth started it when they made, you know, a bit of a mess up of it. But thank you very much. We will make sure that we yes, we'll remind people about your book. So thank you for letting, thank you very much for letting us know about that. And it would be fabulous, wouldn't it, if we could arrange a visit in late June. I mean, let's cross all our fingers and toes for that.
Absolutely, yes.
So thank you, because it would be so good to do that. And this is a belated follow-up to our visit, and it's been well worth waiting for. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Jan. Thanks very much.
It's all right.
Just wanted to say, as we are sort of coming to the close, that the Hampshire Field Club is doing all sorts of interesting things, mainly on its website at the moment, as we try and organise talks and so on, and Zoom lectures. But by all means, please have a look at the Hampshire Field Club website at hansfieldclub.org.uk. We've got all sorts of interesting online stuff with things like walks, off the beaten track things and what have you. So please have a look at that. A second thing I wanted to mention was, as I said earlier, David Dawson at Devises Museum, or Wiltshire Museum, I believe it's called, has helped us facilitate this talk, and we are extremely grateful to him.
Yes.
Obviously, the Wiltshire Museum represents the Wiltshire Archaeological Natural History Society, which is the society next to us, as it were. So it's great that we're both working together. What I would say is, go onto his website and have a look at some of his events, because if you think this talk was good, you should see some of the ones that David's organising and has been organising over the last 6 months or so. They are really, really good. They've had people calling in from all over the world to watch them. And of course, it means that because everything's online, it means that we can have speakers from various parts of the country as well. So they've been great. Have a look at their website, go to some of his events. And finally, I suppose I shall put this up again, because this is my plug to make sure that Mike gets me a nice signed copy. I will pay for it, Mike. Don't worry, I'll pay for it. But it looks like it's going to be a real bestseller, and I'm looking forward to that. So we'll leave you with that on screen, I think.
Yes.
So basically, it just means for me to wish you all, thank you very, very much for coming along, for booking and logging in, and to wish you all a safe journey home, I suppose. I suppose many people have got far to go, but there you go. So thank you to Jan, thank you, Mike, thank you, David, and most of all, thank you.